The morning light filtered through the blinds in thin, golden streaks, painting stripes across my cluttered desk. I sat there, staring at the glowing screen of my laptop, trying to focus on the report due by noon. But my mind kept wandering, as it always did these days, back to him, my roommate Alex. He wasn't supposed to be this complicated. Roommates weren't supposed to make your chest tighten every time they walked into a room or leave you second-guessing their intentions when they lingered too long in doorways. Alex had been living with me for almost 2 years now, ever since we graduated college and decided splitting rent would save us both from financial ruin. On paper, he was perfect, reliable, funny, easygoing. He paid his half of the bills on time, never left dirty dishes in the sink, and even remembered to buy milk when we ran out. To anyone else, he probably seemed like the ideal cohabitant. But lately, something about him felt off. Or maybe it wasn't him at all. Maybe it was me that I sighed, leaning back in my chair and rubbing my temples. My thoughts were a tangled mess, looping endlessly between guilt and curiosity. It started a few weeks ago, or maybe it had always been there, and I'd just chosen not to notice. At first, it was small things. Catching him watching me change out of the corner of my eye, pretending he hadn't noticed when I called him out on it. "Oh, sorry," he'd say with that sheepish grin of his, scratching the back of his neck like he'd done nothing wrong. And then he'd walk away, leaving me standing there in my boxers, wondering if I'd imagined the way his gaze lingered just a little too long that at first, I chalked it up to coincidence. People glance at each other. It's normal. But it kept happening. Not every day, but often enough that I couldn't ignore it anymore. The worst part? I didn't know how to feel about it. Part of me wanted to confront him, demand an explanation for why he kept doing it. Another part, the quieter, more dangerous part, liked it. Liked the way it made my skin prickle with awareness. Liked the way it forced me to think about him in ways I shouldn't. That I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of confusion clouding my brain. This wasn't helping me finish my work. Besides, what did it matter? Alex was straight. He had a girlfriend, Sarah, who came over once or twice a week. They weren't serious, but they were definitely together. So whatever weird energy existed between us was probably all in my head. Just another symptom of being stuck in this endless cycle of longing and loneliness. That MY phone buzzed on the desk, snapping me out of my thoughts. It was a text from my best friend, Mia. Asterisk, hey, you alive? Haven't heard from you in days. Asterisk, I smiled faintly, typing out a quick reply. Asterisk, barely. Work's killing me. Asterisk, she responded almost instantly. Asterisk, want me to come over tonight? Bring wine and bad advice? Asterisk, despite myself, I laughed. Mia had a way of cutting through my self-doubt with her sharp wit and no-nonsense attitude. Spending time with her usually helped me put things into perspective. But tonight I hesitated. Alex would be home, and the last thing I needed was for him to overhear one of our conversations about my non-existent love life. He already teased me mercilessly whenever I mentioned dating, or rather, my lack thereof. You're too picky, he'd say, smirking. Or maybe you're holding out for someone special. His words always sounded innocent enough, but lately they carried an undertone I couldn't quite place. Like he knew something I didn't. Before I could respond to Mia, the sound of the front door opening pulled my attention away from my phone. Heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway, followed by the familiar jingle of keys being tossed onto the kitchen counter. Alex was home early. Great. I glanced at the clock. It was barely 3 o'clock. What was he doing here? Curiosity got the better of me, and I pushed away from my desk, padding barefoot toward the living room. Sure enough, there he was, lounging on the couch with his legs stretched out in front of him and a bag of chips resting on his lap. He looked up as I entered, his dark eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my breath hitch. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he grinned, breaking the spell. "Hey," he said casually, popping a chip into his mouth. "Didn't expect to see you here." "Yeah, well, some of us actually have jobs," I shot back, crossing my arms over my chest. The comment earned me a laugh, low and warm, sending a shiver down my spine despite myself. God, I hated how effortlessly he could disarm me. "Touché," he said, leaning back against the cushions. "But technically, I do have a job. I just finished early today. Thought I'd surprise you." His tone was playful, but there was something beneath it. a flicker of uncertainty, maybe, or anticipation. I couldn't tell. Well, consider me surprised, I muttered, shifting uncomfortably under his gaze. Why did he have to look at me like that? Like he was seeing straight through me, past the walls I'd built to keep people out. It was unnerving, and yet, I couldn't bring myself to look away. For a while, we just stared at each other, the silence stretching taut between us like a wire ready to snap. Finally, Alex broke it, clearing his throat and sitting up slightly. So, how's work going? He asked, his voice softer now, almost hesitant. It's fine, I replied quickly, avoiding his eyes. Just busy, you know? He nodded, though I could tell he didn't fully believe me. That was the thing about Alex. He saw too much, noticed too much. Even when I tried to hide behind sarcasm or indifference, he always found a way to peel back the layers until he reached the truth. Sometimes it felt like he knew me better than I knew myself. And maybe that was the real problem. Because if he really did know me, if he could see the cracks in my carefully constructed facade, then he must have realized by now that I wasn't as indifferent to him as I pretended to be. That every stolen glance, every accidental brush of hands, sent sparks shooting through my veins. That I spent hours lying awake at night, replaying moments between us and wondering if they meant anything at all. But Alex wasn't supposed to mean anything. He was my roommate, my friend, straight, unavailable, completely off limits. And yet, here we were, caught in this strange limbo where nothing was said but everything was felt, where the air crackled with unspoken words and unresolved tension, pulling us closer even as logic screamed for us to stay apart. That I swallowed hard, forcing myself to take a step back. Anyway, I should get back to work, I mumbled, turning toward the hallway before he could respond. My heart was pounding, my palms slick with sweat. I needed space, distance, anything to break the spell he seemed to cast over me. Without even trying, yes, I retreated to my room. I heard him call after me, his voice tinged with amusement. Don't work too hard, okay? I closed the door behind me, leaning against it and letting out a shaky breath. This couldn't keep going on like this. Something had to give, but deep down, I already knew the truth. No matter how hard I tried to resist, Alex had burrowed his way under my skin, and there was no getting him out. It happened on a Tuesday night, of all nights. The kind of night where the world outside felt impossibly quiet, like even the stars were holding their breath. I had just finished dinner, a sad microwave meal that tasted more like regret than anything else, and was sprawled on the couch scrolling through social media when Alex appeared in the doorway. He looked different, not in an obvious way, but there was something about the set of his shoulders, the faint crease between his eyebrows, that told me something was weighing on him. You okay? I asked before I could stop myself. It wasn't unusual for us to check in with each other. We'd lived together long enough for small acts of concern to become second nature. But tonight, my question hung in the air longer than it should have. Alex hesitated, leaning against the doorframe with one hand shoved into the pocket of his hoodie. Yeah, he said finally, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. Just tired, I guess. I nodded, pretending to focus on my phone again, but my attention stayed fixed on him. Something was off. Normally, Alex wore his emotions lightly, brushing them aside with a joke or a shrug. Seeing him like this, guarded, almost fragile, was unsettling. And yet, it drew me in, like gravity pulling me toward a black hole I couldn't escape. Want to talk about it? I offered after a beat, glancing up at him. My tone was casual, but inside, my pulse quickened. Offering to listen felt dangerous. Like opening a door I might not be able to close once he stepped through. He shook his head, offering a tight smile. No, it's fine. Just work stuff. But instead of leaving, he lingered, his gaze drifting to the empty spot on the couch beside me. After a moment, he crossed the room and sank down next to me, close enough that our knees nearly touched. The proximity made my skin prickle, and I shifted slightly, trying to create some distance without making it obvious. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched out, heavy and charged, until Alex broke it with a soft laugh. You know what's messed up? Sometimes I feel like I don't even know who I am anymore. The words caught me off guard. They were so raw, so unfiltered, that they knocked the wind out of me. This wasn't the Alex I knew, the one who breezed through life with effortless charm and a devil-may-care attitude. This version of him was vulnerable, exposed, and achingly human. "What do you mean?" I asked quietly, turning to face him. His eyes met mine briefly before darting away, as if he regretted saying anything at all. "I don't know," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "It's like everyone expects me to be this certain way, you know? Like I'm supposed to fit into this box. And if I don't, then something's wrong with me." He paused, exhaling sharply. Does that make sense? It did, more than he probably realized. I'd spent most of my life feeling the same way, like I was constantly performing, putting on a mask to hide the parts of myself I was afraid people wouldn't accept. Hearing him articulate those feelings hit me somewhere deep, stirring up memories I'd rather keep buried. "Yeah," I said softly. "It makes total sense." We sat there for a while longer, the weight of his confession settling between us like a third presence. I wanted to say something, anything, to ease the tension, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I found myself studying him, noticing the way the dim light from the lamp cast shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the curve of his lips. He looked beautiful, though I hated myself for thinking it. Beautiful and unreachable. Eventually, he broke the silence with a self-deprecating chuckle. "So, ma, didn't mean to unload on you like that. Must sound pretty pathetic, huh?" "No," I replied quickly, maybe too quickly. "Not pathetic, honest." And honestly, I trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. What I wanted to say was important, that hearing him open up like this mattered to me in ways I couldn't fully explain. But admitting that felt like crossing a line I wasn't ready to cross. Instead, I settled for a safer response. "Honestly, it helps. Knowing you're not alone, I mean." He smiled faintly, though there was still a sadness lingering in his expression. "Thanks," he murmured. Then, after a pause, he added, "You're good at this, you know, listening." The compliment caught me off guard, sending a flush of heat creeping up my neck. Thanks," I mumbled, looking away. "I try." Another stretch of silence followed, but this time it felt less awkward and more comfortable. Like we'd reached some unspoken understanding, a shared acknowledgement of the complexities we both carried beneath the surface. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to imagine what it would be like to let him in completely, to share the pieces of myself I kept hidden from everyone else. But just as quickly, I pushed the thought aside. Some doors weren't meant to be opened. When Alex finally stood to leave, stretching his arms above his head with a yawn, I felt a pang of disappointment. "Well, I should probably crash," he said, ruffling his hair absently. "Big day tomorrow, right?" I replied, forcing a smile. "Good night." As he disappeared down the hallway, I slumped back against the couch, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My heart was racing, my thoughts spinning in circles as I replayed the conversation over and over in my mind. What had just happened? Was it possible that Alex felt the same disconnect, the same uncertainty about who he was supposed to be? Or was I reading too much into things, projecting my own fears onto him? The questions swirled endlessly, keeping me awake long after he'd gone to bed. By the time morning rolled around, I still didn't have any answers. But one thing was clear. Something had shifted between us. A crack had formed in the foundation of our friendship, letting in a sliver of light. And with it, the promise of something neither of us was ready to name. Over the next few days, things between us felt different. Not necessarily bad, but charged like the air before a storm. Alex seemed more subdued than usual, quieter, as if he were carrying the weight of whatever he'd confessed that night. Meanwhile, I found myself hyper-aware of his presence, acutely attuned to every glance, every word, every subtle shift in his demeanor. It didn't help that we kept finding ourselves in situations that blurred the lines between friendship and something more. Like the time I walked into the kitchen late one evening to grab a glass of water, only to find him standing shirtless in front of the sink, washing dishes. His back was turned to me, the muscles in his shoulders flexing with each movement. And for a moment, I froze, unable to look away. When he turned around and caught me staring, I stammered out an excuse about being thirsty and practically fled the room, my face burning with embarrassment, or the time we ended up sharing a blanket on the couch while watching a movie. At first, it was innocent enough. He draped the blanket over both of us without comment, and I didn't think twice about it. But as the hours passed, the warmth of his body seeped through the fabric, making it impossible to ignore how close we were. Every accidental brush of his arm against mine sent sparks shooting through my veins, leaving me torn between wanting to move closer and needing to put space between us. Each encounter chipped away at my defenses, exposing cracks I hadn't known were there. And the more I tried to convince myself that nothing was happening, the harder it became to deny the truth. Alex was getting under my skin in ways I couldn't control. Worse, I wasn't sure I wanted to stop him. But obstacles loomed large on the horizon, casting long shadows over whatever fragile connection we were building. There was Sarah, of course, his girlfriend, whose existence served as a constant reminder of everything I couldn't have. She stopped by less frequently these days, citing work commitments or family obligations, but her absence only deepened the guilt gnawing at the edges of my conscience. How could I even entertain thoughts of Alex when he belonged to someone else? Then there was the bigger issue, Alex himself. For all his moments of vulnerability, for all the signs that hinted at something deeper lurking beneath the surface, he was still straight, or at least that's what he claimed to be. Maybe he was questioning things, exploring parts of himself he'd never dared to acknowledge before. Or maybe I was misinterpreting everything, seeing patterns where none existed. Either way, pursuing anything with him felt like playing with fire, risking not only my heart, but also the friendship we'd built over years of living together. And yet, despite the risks, despite the uncertainty, I couldn't bring myself to walk away. Because buried beneath the fear and doubt was a flicker of hope, a tiny, stubborn belief that maybe, just maybe, Alex felt the same pull I did. That maybe this strange, electric tension between us wasn't one-sided after all. So I waited, clinging to fragments of conversations and stolen glances, searching for clues that might confirm my suspicions. And though I told myself it was futile, that nothing could ever come of this, part of me refused to give up. Not yet. Not when the possibility of something real still lingered, tantalizingly out of reach. It started with small things, moments that, on their own, might have seemed insignificant, but together began to weave a pattern I couldn't ignore. Like the way Alex always seemed to know when I needed coffee. On mornings when my alarm blared too early and my head felt like it was stuffed with cotton, he'd appear in the kitchen, already dressed for work, holding out a steaming mug of black coffee, just the way I liked it. "Thought you could use this," he'd say with a smirk, brushing past me as if it were no big deal. But his fingers would linger against mine for just a fraction of a second longer than necessary, sending a jolt of electricity up my arm, or the late-night conversations that stretched into the early hours of the morning, fueled by takeout containers and half-empty bottles of wine. We talked about everything and nothing, our favorite childhood memories, the books we'd read until the pages fell apart, the places we dreamed of visiting someday. His voice had a way of wrapping around me, low and steady, making me feel safe in ways I hadn't realized I craved. And sometimes, when he laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that made his whole body shake. I found myself laughing too, even if I didn't fully understand the joke. It wasn't about what we said. It was about how those moments made me feel. Seen, heard alive. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at work, I came home to find Alex sprawled on the couch, guitar resting lazily across his lap. He looked up as I walked in, his face breaking into a grin. "Hey," he greeted, strumming a soft chord. "Want to hear something?" I hesitated, dropping my bag by the door. Music had always been his thing, not mine. I didn't have an ear for it. Couldn't tell a G major from a C minor. But there was something so inviting about the way he held the instrument, the way his fingers moved deftly over the strings, that I nodded and sank onto the couch beside him. He launched into a song I didn't recognize, his voice rough but tender, filling the room with a melody that tugged at something deep inside me. I closed my eyes, letting the music wash over me, feeling the vibrations of the guitar resonate through the cushions beneath us. When the last note faded away, I opened my eyes to find him watching me, his expression unreadable. "What?" I asked, suddenly self-conscious. "Nothing," he said softly, shaking his head. "Just you looked peaceful." The words caught me off guard, and I felt heat rise to my cheeks. "Yeah, well, your singing's not bad either," I teased, trying to lighten the mood. But the moment hung between us, heavy and charged, until he broke it with a chuckle and handed me the guitar. "Your turn," he said, nudging me playfully. "I don't know how to play," I protested, holding up my hands in mock surrender. "Sure you do," he countered, scooting closer and guiding my fingers to the fretboard. "Here, let me show you." His hand covered mine, warm and calloused, as he adjusted my grip. "Now press down here, yeah, like that. Good." His breath tickled my ear as he leaned in to demonstrate, and I swallowed hard, acutely aware of how close he was. The scent of his cologne, something woody and faintly spicy, filled my senses, making it hard to concentrate. "Like this," I managed, fumbling through a clumsy attempt at a chord. "Close enough," he said, laughing softly. "See? You're a natural." I rolled my eyes, though I couldn't suppress the smile tugging at my lips. "Yeah, right? If being a natural means sounding like a dying cat, then sure." "Hey, don't sell yourself short," he teased, bumping his shoulder against mine. "You've got potential. Just needs practice." We spent the next hour, or maybe longer, like that, him teaching me basic chords while cracking jokes about my lack of rhythm. By the end of it, my fingers were sore, and my stomach hurt from laughing so much. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, I forgot to overthink things, forgot to analyze every word and gesture for hidden meaning. Instead, I let myself exist in the moment, reveling in the simple joy of being near him. But as the days turned into weeks, those moments became harder to compartmentalize. Every shared laugh, every accidental touch, left me craving more. And yet, with each step forward, doubt crept in, whispering cruel truths I tried desperately to ignore. What if I was misreading everything? What if Alex's kindness, his attentiveness, meant nothing more than friendship? One afternoon, as we sat side by side on the balcony overlooking the city, I finally gave voice to the question that had been gnawing at me for weeks. "Do you ever think about settling down?" I asked cautiously, keeping my eyes trained on the skyline. "Like, finding someone who really gets you?" Alex was quiet for a long moment, and I braced myself for dismissal, for some flippant remark that would shut the conversation down before it went anywhere. But instead, he sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but it's complicated, you know? People expect certain things from you. They want you to fit into these neat little boxes, and if you don't," he trailed off, shrugging. "Anyway, why are you asking?" "No reason." I lied quickly, my pulse quickening. "Just curious." He studied me for a moment, his gaze piercing, as if he could see straight through my evasive answer. Then he smiled faintly, turning his attention back to the view. "What about you?" he asked. "Ever think about it?" My throat tightened, and I forced myself to take a sip of water to buy time. Did I dare tell him the truth? That yes, I thought about it all the time. That I wanted someone who would look at me the way he sometimes looked at me, with warmth and curiosity and something unspoken flickering in their eyes. But saying it aloud felt like stepping off a cliff, trusting that the fall wouldn't kill me. Instead, I shrugged, feigning nonchalance. "Maybe. I don't know. Seems like a lot of work." He laughed, though there was a hint of sadness in it. "Yeah, it is, but maybe it's worth it." The comment hung in the air between us, loaded with implications I wasn't ready to unpack. So I changed the subject, steering us towards safer territory, work, movies, anything to distract from the ache building in my chest. Yet even as we joked and teased each other, the weight of his words lingered, planting seeds of hope I knew I shouldn't nurture. For every moment of connection, there were others that reminded me of the distance between us. Like the time Sarah showed up unannounced, her presence casting a shadow over whatever fragile bond Alex and I were building. She was kind, smart, beautiful, the kind of person anyone would be lucky to have in their life. Watching them together, seeing the way she lit up around him, made me feel like an intruder in my own home. "You guys are cute," I said once, mostly to fill the awkward silence that settled over dinner one night. It was true, in a way they were, but the words tasted bitter on my tongue, leaving behind a sour residue I couldn't rinse away. Thanks, Alex replied, glancing at Sarah with a fondness that twisted my gut. We try. I forced a smile, excusing myself to clear the dishes before the conversation could go any further. In the kitchen, I leaned against the counter, gripping the edge so tightly my knuckles turned white. Guilt clawed at me, sharp and relentless, reminding me of everything I stood to lose if I acted on my feelings. This wasn't fair to Sarah, to Alex, or to myself. And yet, despite the guilt, despite the fear, I couldn't stop myself from seeking him out whenever she wasn't around. There was something magnetic about him, something that drew me in even as logic screamed for me to pull away. Like the time we decided to tackle the mountain of laundry piling up in the corner of the living room. What started as a mundane chore quickly devolved into a full-blown pillow fight, feathers flying everywhere as we chased each other around the apartment. "You're gonna pay for that," Alex shouted, laughing as he lunged for me, tackling me onto the couch. We wrestled for a moment, breathless and giggling like kids, until he pinned me down, his hands pressing lightly against my wrists. For a split second, we froze, our laughter fading into something quieter, heavier. His eyes searched mine, dark and intense, and I felt my heart stutter in my chest. Was he going to kiss me? Did I want him to? Before I could decide, he released me, rolling off the couch with a sheepish grin. "Truce," he offered, extending a hand. "Truce," I echoed weakly, accepting it. But the memory of his weight on top of me, the heat of his skin against mine, stayed with me long after the feathers had been swept away. That as the weeks passed, the line between friendship and something more continued to blur. Each interaction carried the weight of unspoken longing, of questions neither of us dared to ask. And though I told myself it was hopeless, that nothing could ever come of this, part of me refused to give up entirely. Because buried beneath the fear and uncertainty was a stubborn, irrational hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, Alex felt it too. That maybe this strange, electric tension between us wasn't one-sided after all. I held on, clinging to fragments of moments and whispered promises, searching for signs that might confirm my suspicions. And though I knew it was reckless, though I knew it could only end in heartbreak, I couldn't bring myself to let go. Not yet. Not when the possibility of something real still lingered, tantalizingly out of reach. It was raining the night everything changed. Not the gentle kind of rain that soothes and lulls you into quiet reflection, but the kind that pounds against windows and drowns out all other sounds. A relentless, chaotic downpour that mirrored the storm brewing inside me. I'd spent most of the evening holed up in my room, trying to distract myself with a book I couldn't focus on, while Alex was in the living room, nursing what had to be his third beer. We hadn't spoken much since dinner, both of us retreating into our own corners like we often did when things felt off. But tonight, the silence between us wasn't comfortable. It was heavy, oppressive, like it was pressing down on my chest and making it hard to breathe. Every time I heard him shift on the couch or exhale sharply, my pulse quickened, as if my body knew something my mind wasn't ready to admit. Something was coming, something inevitable, and no amount of pretending could stop it. Finally, unable to stand the tension any longer, I pushed away from my desk and stepped into the hallway. The apartment was dimly lit, the only source of light coming from the flickering glow of the TV screen. Alex sat slouched on the couch, his head tilted back against the cushion, eyes closed. For a moment, I just stood there, watching him. His shirt clung loosely to his frame, damp from where he'd been leaning against the window earlier, and his hair was tousled in that careless way that made my stomach twist. He looked exhausted, vulnerable, achingly human. "Hey," I said softly, breaking the silence. My voice sounded strange, almost foreign, even to my own ears. His eyes fluttered open, meeting mine with a gaze so intense it took everything in me not to look away. "Hey," he replied, his tone low and rough around the edges. He didn't smile, didn't offer one of his usual quips. Instead, he patted the empty space beside him, wordlessly inviting me to join him. That I hesitated, torn between the urge to flee and the desperate need to close the distance between us. In the end, curiosity, Or maybe something deeper won out. I crossed the room and sank onto the couch, leaving a careful gap between us. Neither of us spoke for a while, the sound of the rain filling the void. Then, without warning, Alex turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "You've been avoiding me," he said bluntly, his words cutting through the haze of uncertainty like a knife. "What?" I stammered, caught off guard. "No, I haven't." "Yes, you have." His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. Ever since Sarah came over last week. You've barely said 2 words to me unless you had to." The accusation stung, not because it wasn't true, but because hearing him say it aloud made it real. I opened my mouth to deny it, to deflect with some lame excuse about work or stress, but the words died on my tongue. What was the point? He already knew. Maybe he'd always known. "I'm sorry," I muttered finally, staring at my hands. "It's just complicated." "Complicated how?" He pressed, leaning closer. "Talk to me, man. Whatever it is, we can figure it out." His proximity sent a jolt of electricity through me, and I shifted uncomfortably, wishing I could disappear into the couch cushions. How could I explain something I barely understood myself? How could I put into words the tangled web of longing, guilt, and fear that had been consuming me for weeks? "It's nothing," I lied, shaking my head. "Just forget it." "No." The sharpness in his tone startled me, and I glanced up to find him glaring at me, frustration etched across his features. "Don't shut me out. Not now. Not after everything." "Everything," I echoed, my heart pounding. "What are you talking about?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. For a moment, he looked like he might back down, retreat behind the walls he usually kept so carefully intact. But then he straightened, his jaw tightening with resolve. "You really don't get it, do you?" he asked, his voice softer now, but no less intense. "Every time you look at me, every time you laugh or smile or brush past me like I'm nothing, it kills me. Because I want more, okay? I want? God, I don't even know what I want. But it's not this." The confession hit me like a punch to the gut, knocking the air from my lungs. I stared at him, stunned, my mind racing to process what he'd just said. Did he mean? No, that couldn't be right. He was straight. He had Sarah. This had to be some kind of misunderstanding. "What are you saying?" I whispered, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to steady it. That he let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "I don't know, all right? All I know is that I can't keep pretending anymore. Pretending that I don't notice the way you look at me, the way your hand brushes mine by accident. Pretending that I don't feel it too, that pull, that connection. It's driving me crazy." My chest tightened, a mixture of relief and terror coursing through me. Relief because I wasn't imagining things, because the feelings I'd buried so deep weren't one-sided after all. Terror because now there was no going back. Now we were standing on the edge of something neither of us fully understood, and taking the next step meant risking everything. I started, then stopped, unsure how to continue. How could I possibly articulate the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me? Instead, I reached out tentatively, my fingers brushing against his. His hand was warm, solid, grounding me in a way I desperately needed. When he didn't pull away, I took a shaky breath and tried again. "I thought you were straight," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I was imagining things." "So did I," he confessed, his thumb moving gently over my knuckles. "For a long time, I convinced myself that it didn't matter, that I could ignore it. But I can't. Not anymore." The honesty in his words undid me, unraveling the last threads of resistance I'd been clinging to. Without thinking, I leaned forward, closing the gap between us until our foreheads touched. His breath hitched, warm and uneven against my lips. And for a moment, we simply stayed like that, suspended in the fragile space between hesitation and surrender. Then, slowly, deliberately, he closed the remaining distance, pressing his mouth to mine. The kiss was soft, tentative, as if he were afraid I might vanish if he pushed too hard. But beneath the gentleness was an undercurrent of raw emotion, of years of unspoken longing finally spilling over. My heart raced, my hands instinctively reaching up to cup his face, pulling him closer. The world outside, the rain, the city, the endless noise, faded away, leaving only the warmth of his skin, the taste of his lips, the weight of his body against mine. When we finally broke apart, gasping for air, neither of us spoke. There was no need. Everything we'd been too afraid to say had passed between us in that single, life-altering moment. And though I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, knew there would be questions and challenges and sacrifices, I also knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened next, we'd face it together. Because in that moment, as the rain continued to pour outside and the faint scent of beer lingered in the air, I realized something I'd been denying for far too long. This was worth fighting for. The morning after the kiss was surreal. Sunlight streamed through the blinds, painting golden stripes across the floor, but it felt like an intrusion, a cruel reminder that the world outside hadn't stopped spinning just because ours had tilted on its axis. I woke up tangled in my sheets, the memory of Alex's lips still lingering on mine, and for a moment, I let myself believe it had all been real, that last night hadn't been some fever dream born of longing and desperation. But then reality crashed back in, sharp and unrelenting. What had we done? More importantly, what happened now? I padded into the kitchen, half expecting to find him there, nursing a cup of coffee like he always did. Instead, the room was empty, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the remnants of last night's chaos scattered across the counter. Empty beer bottles, crumpled napkins, the ghost of our shared vulnerability, hanging heavy in the air. My stomach churned as I poured myself a glass of water, trying to steady the storm brewing inside me. When Alex finally emerged from his room an hour later, dressed in sweatpants and a hoodie, his hair sticking up at odd angles, the tension between us was palpable. He hesitated in the doorway, his gaze flickering toward me before darting away, as if he wasn't sure how to act. Neither was I. "Hey," he said finally, his voice rough with sleep, or maybe something else. "You okay?" "I'm fine," I replied quickly, too quickly. The lie tasted bitter on my tongue, but I forced a smile anyway, hoping it would mask the turmoil beneath the surface. "What about you?" He shrugged, leaning against the counter. "Same." We stood there for a while, neither of us speaking, the silence stretching taut like a wire ready to snap. Finally, I broke it, unable to bear the weight any longer. "About last night," "Yeah," he interrupted, running a hand through his hair. "We should probably talk about that." His words sent a jolt of panic through me. Talk about it? What was there to say? Last night had been everything I'd secretly wanted but never dared to hope for. And yet, now that it was real, now that it existed outside the confines of my imagination, it felt terrifyingly fragile. Like a single misstep could shatter it completely. "I don't regret it," I blurted out before I could stop myself. "If that's what you're worried about." Alex blinked, caught off guard by my admission. Then he smiled faintly, though there was a sadness lurking behind it. "Me neither," he said softly. "But this changes things, doesn't it?" It was a rhetorical question, but it hung in the air between us nonetheless, heavy with implications. Yes, it changed things. It changed everything. And not just for us, for Sarah, for our friends, for the carefully constructed lives we'd built around the illusion of normalcy. How could we possibly navigate this without losing ourselves or each other? In the process, over the next few days, we tiptoed around each other, both of us acutely aware of the invisible line we'd crossed. Conversations were stilted, filled with awkward pauses and forced laughter. Even mundane tasks like doing dishes or folding laundry felt charged, as if every interaction carried the potential to unravel the fragile truce we'd established. Meanwhile, guilt gnawed at me relentlessly. Every time my phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, asking how Alex was doing, when they should meet up again, I felt like a fraud, complicit in a betrayal I couldn't undo. She didn't deserve this. None of us did. And yet, despite the guilt, despite the fear, there were moments when I allowed myself to imagine a future where we didn't have to hide. Where Alex and I could exist openly, honestly, without the constant threat of judgment or rejection looming over us. Those moments were fleeting, stolen glimpses of a life that felt impossibly far away. But they kept me going, fueling the stubborn hope that refused to die. Point one evening. After another strained dinner and a tense game of pretend everything's normal, Alex cornered me in the hallway. "We can't keep doing this," he said, his voice low but urgent. "Pretending nothing's changed. It's killing me." "I know," I admitted, leaning against the wall. "But what are we supposed to do? Tell her? Just rip the bandage off and deal with the fallout?" He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Would that really be so bad? At least then we wouldn't have to lie anymore." "It's not that simple," I shot back, frustration bubbling to the surface. "This isn't just about her. It's about us, about who we are and what we want. Are you ready for that? Because I'm not sure I am." The truth of my words hit us both like a punch to the gut. For all the longing, all the connection we'd shared, neither of us was fully prepared to face the consequences of what we'd started. We were standing on the edge of a precipice, staring into the unknown, and the thought of jumping terrified me. Things came to a head a week later, when Sarah unexpectedly dropped by. I was in my room, headphones on, trying to drown out the noise in my head with music, when I heard her cheerful greeting echo through the apartment. My heart sank. Of course, she'd choose today to visit. The one day when Alex and I had barely exchanged more than a handful of words that I stayed hidden in my room, listening to their muffled conversation through the walls. Her laugh sounded lighter than usual, almost nervous, and Alex's responses were clipped, distant. Something was wrong. I could feel it in the air, thick and suffocating. Finally, curiosity got the better of me, and I ventured into the living room. Sarah was sitting on the couch, twisting a strand of her hair around her finger, while Alex paced in front of her, his movements restless and agitated. When they saw me, Sarah offered a tentative smile. "Hey," she said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "Didn't mean to interrupt." "You're not interrupting," Alex replied quickly, though his tone suggested otherwise. He glanced at me, his eyes pleading, and I knew instantly that something big was coming. "I need to tell you something," he began, turning back to Sarah. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, his shoulders hunched as if bracing for impact. "Something important." Her expression shifted, alarm flashing across her features. "Okay," she said slowly, sitting up straighter. "What is it?" For a moment, no one spoke. The silence stretched out, unbearable and deafening, until Alex finally exhaled sharply and met her gaze. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Us. I'm sorry, Sarah. I never meant to hurt you." Her face fell, confusion giving way to hurt and anger. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Is this about someone else? Is it him?" She gestured toward me, her eyes narrowing. "No," Alex insisted, shaking his head. "It's not about anyone else. It's about me. About who I am. I've been lying to you, to myself, and I can't keep doing it." The room seemed to shrink around us, the air growing heavier with each passing second. Sarah stared at him, tears welling in her eyes, and I felt like an intruder in a moment I had no right to witness. Yet I couldn't look away, couldn't move, frozen by the weight of what was unfolding. "I think I'm gay," Alex admitted finally, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Or bi. I don't even know. All I know is that I can't keep pretending to be something I'm not." The confession hung in the air, raw and unfiltered, leaving behind a stunned silence. Sarah looked like she'd been punched, her face pale and stricken. For a long moment, she didn't speak, didn't move. Then, without a word, she grabbed her bag and bolted for the door, slamming it shut behind her. The sound reverberated through the apartment, echoing in the hollow space left in her wake. Alex sank onto the couch, burying his face in his hands, and I instinctively moved to sit beside him, placing a tentative hand on his shoulder. He flinched at first, then leaned into the touch, his body trembling with the force of emotions he'd been holding back for so long. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this." "I know," I murmured, squeezing his shoulder gently. "You did the right thing." But even as I said the words, doubt crept in. Had he? Or had we made a terrible mistake, setting off a chain reaction we weren't equipped to handle? Only time would tell. Did I end the days that followed? The fallout spread like ripples in a pond. Friends asked questions we weren't ready to answer. Work became a minefield of sidelong glances and whispered gossip. And Sarah, well, Sarah disappeared entirely, blocking both of us on social media and refusing to return Alex's calls. Each piece of collateral damage weighed heavily on us, testing the fragile bond we'd only just begun to build. Yet amidst the chaos, there were moments of clarity, small victories that reminded me why we'd taken this leap in the first place. Like the night Alex held my hand in public for the first time, his grip firm despite the nervous tremor in his fingers. Or the mornings when we woke up together, sunlight streaming through the window, and for a brief moment, the world felt perfect. Still, uncertainty lingered, casting shadows over our newfound happiness. Would we survive the scrutiny? Could we truly make this work? Or were we destined to crumble under the pressure? These questions haunted me, keeping me awake at night and coloring every decision we made. But for now, we held on, clinging to each other, to the promise of something real and beautiful, even as the storm raged on around us. Because in the end, love wasn't about having all the answers. It was about finding the courage to ask the questions and trusting that somehow, someway, you'd find your way through. Months passed, and the sharp edges of the storm began to soften. Life didn't return to normal. Not the kind of normal we'd known before, but it settled into something new, something raw and imperfect yet undeniably real. The fallout from Alex's confession had been brutal, leaving scars that would take time to heal. But in its wake, there was also clarity, a sense of purpose neither of us had dared to imagine when this journey began. That we moved out of the apartment together, trading the cramped space filled with memories of Sarah and our old lives for a smaller place downtown. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom walk-up with creaky floors and peeling paint, but it felt like ours. Every box we unpacked, every piece of furniture we arranged, carried the weight of a promise. That no matter what came next, we'd face it side by side. Alex changed in ways I hadn't expected. He became quieter, more introspective, as if he were still processing everything he'd uncovered about himself. Some nights, I'd find him sitting on the fire escape, staring at the city lights with a cigarette dangling loosely from his fingers, a habit he'd picked up during the hardest weeks. Other times, he'd surprise me with bursts of laughter or spontaneous plans. Like the time he dragged me to a karaoke bar at midnight, insisting we needed something reckless. Those moments reminded me why I'd fallen for him in the first place. Because beneath the uncertainty and fear, he was still Alex, vibrant, unpredictable, alive as for me. I realized how much I'd grown too. Before all of this, I'd spent so much of my life hiding, behind sarcasm, behind walls, behind the belief that love was something I could never truly have. But Alex had forced me to confront those fears, to step into the light even when it terrified me. And though I still had moments of doubt, nights when I lay awake wondering if we were strong enough to make it through, I knew deep down that I was better for having loved him. That loving him had made me braver, softer, more willing to risk everything for something worth holding on. One evening, as autumn painted the streets in shades of gold and crimson, we found ourselves wandering through the park near our new apartment. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves and distant bonfires. We walked slowly, hands brushing occasionally until Alex finally reached over and laced his fingers through mine. His touch sent a familiar warmth coursing through me, grounding me in the present moment. "You ever think about what comes next?" he asked after a while, his voice soft but steady. "All the time," I admitted, glancing at him. "But I try not to dwell on it too much. One day at a time, right?" He nodded, though there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Hope, maybe, or determination. "Yeah. Still, sometimes I wonder, do you think people will ever stop judging us? Stop looking at us like we're some kind of anomaly?" I squeezed his hand, offering a small smile. "Probably not. But does it really matter? As long as we know who we are, and as long as we're sure about this, it doesn't matter what anyone else thinks." For a moment, he just looked at me, his expression unreadable. Then he laughed softly, shaking his head. "God, when did you get so wise?" "I've always been wise," I teased, nudging him playfully. "You're just finally paying attention." His laughter echoed around us. mingling with the rustle of leaves and the distant chatter of passersby. In that moment, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the season, I felt a profound sense of peace. Not because everything was perfect, far from it, but because we were learning to navigate the imperfections together. Because despite the challenges, despite the pain, we'd chosen each other. And that choice, fragile as it might be, was the foundation of something extraordinary. Later that night, as we lay tangled in bed, the city humming softly outside our window, Alex turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Do you remember that night it rained?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Of course I do," I replied, smiling faintly. "How could I forget?" He hesitated, tracing lazy circles on my arm with his fingertip. "That was the first time I let myself believe we could actually, you know, be something." I rolled onto my side to face him, studying the curve of his lips, the faint shadow of stubble along his jawline. "And now?" I prompted gently. "Now," he said, his gaze locking onto mine, "I don't want to imagine my life without you in it." The words hit me like a wave, washing away any lingering doubts or fears. I reached out, cupping his cheek in my hand, and kissed him softly. When I pulled back, I whispered, "Good, because I don't want to imagine mine without you either." In the end, love isn't about finding someone who completes you. It's about finding someone who inspires you to become the best version of yourself. Someone who sees your flaws and loves you anyway, who stands beside you even when the world feels like it's crumbling around you. For Alex and me, that journey wasn't easy. It was messy and painful and full of moments where giving up seemed like the only option. But it was also beautiful, in the way sunlight filters through cracks in a broken wall, illuminating the strength hidden within us. I drifted off to sleep that night, Alex's breathing steady beside me. I thought about how far we'd come, from stolen glances and unspoken longing to this, a quiet, imperfect kind of happiness that felt truer than anything I'd ever known. And though I couldn't predict what the future held, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened, we'd face it together. Because love isn't about guarantees. It's about choosing to leap, even when you can't see the ground below.